You're still awake? That's all right. You're safe here. You found your way to the Lady Mythos. Here, we don't hurry. We linger, with stories the world tried to forget, with shadows that stretch across centuries, with kings who carved their names into stone, and gods whose faces were painted in gold leaf and lapis. Before you drift off, if there's a story you'd like me to tell, or a place you're listening from, I'd love to know. Leave me a note anytime. It helps me picture the small circle we're all sitting in, even if we're scattered across the world. You, me, and the myths between us. Tonight, I want to tell you about Khonsu, an Egyptian god of the moon, a protector, a healer, and a traveler. A god who walked softly through the night sky, yet one whom other gods feared for his power. His name, in the language of the Nile, meant the traveler, and like the moon that waxes and wanes above the desert sands, his story moves through time, through hymns, through temples, through stone inscriptions. So, let's step together into that moonlight, into the land of Egypt, where Khonsu was born. Chapter 1. The Child of Amun and Mut. In the heart of ancient Thebes, what we now call Luxor, stood the great temple complex of Karnak. Even today, its ruins stretch across the desert. Colossal pylons, avenues of ram-headed sphinxes, and forests of stone columns rising toward the sky. In this place, the ancient Egyptians built not just for kings, but for their gods. At Thebes, 3 gods formed what was called the Theban Triad. Amun, the hidden one, king of the gods. Mut, the mother goddess, and their son, Khonsu. Khonsu was believed to be the child of Amun and Mut. His statues often show him as a young man, his head shaved, except for the side lock of youth, a symbol of childhood in Egyptian art. On his head rests a lunar disk embraced by a crescent, the mark of the moon. Sometimes he wears the double crown, linking him to kingship. Other times, he appears as a falcon-headed god, recalling Horus and the great sky deities. His name carried meaning. Khonsu, the traveler. To the Egyptians, the moon was not just a light in the darkness. It was a traveler across the night sky. Its cycle marked the passage of time, the rhythm of months, and the guidance of the calendar. The first clear attestations of Khonsu appear in the Middle Kingdom, around the 11th and 12th dynasties. But his worship grew much stronger in the New Kingdom. By the time of Pharaoh Ramses III, around the 12th century BCE, Khonsu had his own great temple at Karnak. Its walls are still standing, covered in hieroglyphs and reliefs that tell us about the rituals performed there. In hymns and inscriptions, Khonsu was described as a god of youth, fertility, and protection. One text calls him Khonsu who gives life. Another, Khonsu the defender, who drives away evil spirits. At Karnak, priests carried statues of Khonsu during night processions. Imagine it. Torches flickering in the dark. Drums and sistrums echoing through the stone halls. The air filled with incense. The people of Thebes would gather, watching as the image of the moon god was carried through the avenues. And yet, there was another side to him. In certain inscriptions, Khonsu is described as so powerful that even other gods feared him. One text says, Khonsu, the greatest god, who has power over evil spirits, who devours those who would oppose him. He was both gentle and dangerous. A protector of children, but also a force no one wished to anger. As the son of Amun and Mut, Khonsu completed the Theban Triad. His presence gave Thebes not only political power, but spiritual prestige. Pharaohs of the new kingdom promoted this triad, for to be associated with Amun, Mut, and Khonsu was to claim the favor of both heaven and earth. But perhaps most importantly, Khonsu was the moon, a god who traveled across the sky each night, watching over the land of Egypt. His light touched the fields along the Nile, the villages, the temples, and the tombs. And so, under the silver light of the Egyptian moon, Khonsu was born as the child of Thebes. The people of Thebes would gather, watching as the image of the moon god was carried through the avenues. And yet, there was another side to him. In certain inscriptions, Khonsu is described as so powerful that even other gods feared him. One text says, Khonsu, the greatest god, who has power over evil spirits, who devours those who would oppose him. He was both gentle and dangerous. A protector of children, but also a force no one wished to anger. As the son of Amun and Mut, Khonsu completed the Theban Triad. His presence gave Thebes not only political power, but spiritual prestige. Pharaohs of the new kingdom promoted this triad, for to be associated with Amun, Mut, and Khonsu was to claim the favor of both heaven and earth. But perhaps most importantly, Khonsu was the moon, a god who traveled across the sky each night, watching over the land of Egypt. His light touched the fields along the Nile, the villages, the temples, and the tombs. And so, under the silver light of the Egyptian moon, Khonsu was born as the child of Thebes, a god of youth, of cycles, of healing, and of mystery. The Egyptians measured their life through cycles of the moon. Every crescent that rose in the evening sky was counted. Every disappearance into darkness was marked with ritual. The phases of the moon structured months, and the months shaped the year. Long before solar calendars became dominant, the Egyptians used the lunar calendar. Months of 29 or 30 days, beginning with the first appearance of the crescent moon. Priests of the temples would climb to high vantage points, watching for that first slender curve of silver on the horizon, then announcing the beginning of a new cycle. In this way, Khonsu was not simply a presence in the sky. He was the one who ordered time. Hymns carved into temple walls call him He who reckons the months, who brings the seasons, who makes all things live according to their time. Think of what that meant in daily life. For farmers, it told them when to sow barley, when to cut flax, when to prepare for harvest. For fishermen, it meant knowing when the Nile's waters would be fullest. For travelers, it meant safe movement at night, the moonlight guiding their boats across the river, or their caravans across desert tracks. And for priests, the moon was central to worship. Festivals could not take place on just any day. They had to align with sacred rhythms, the invisible order of the heavens. Without Khonsu's light to guide them, rituals would fall out of balance. At Karnak, in the temple of Khonsu, built during the reign of Ramses III, reliefs show the god seated with a lunar disk above his head. Inscriptions call him the reckoner of time and he who brings the crescent. Within those walls, priests lit lamps and burned incense as the moon rose, believing Khonsu himself travelled with it, passing above them, watching as the torches below mirrored his glow. The ceilings of Egyptian temples often bore astronomical symbols. Rows of stars, constellations, and sometimes careful calculations of celestial events. But always, the moon held pride of place. It was the most visible marker of sacred time, the companion of priests who counted days and nights, who watched and recorded the heavens. Khonsu's connection with time also linked him to Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom and writing. Together, the two formed a balance. Thoth, the recorder, Khonsu, the traveller. One inscribed the rhythms of the cosmos in writing, the other embodied them visibly in the sky. In fact, in some texts, the two gods almost overlap. But while Thoth was a figure of scribal knowledge, abstract, intellectual, Khonsu was a living presence. Anyone could see him, simply by lifting their gaze on a moonlit night. For ordinary people, Khonsu's cycles were woven into life in quieter ways too. Women who longed for children prayed to him because the moon's cycle was connected with fertility, with the hidden rhythms of the body. Parents called upon him to protect infants from illness. Travelers invoked him to guard against dangers of the night. Even pharaohs leaned on Khonsu's timing. To be in harmony with Khonsu's cycle was to be in harmony with the very fabric of the cosmos. An inscription of Ramses IV speaks of offerings given to Khonsu so that time would continue, the crops would flourish, and the land would be in balance. And here lies the quiet beauty of Khonsu. He was not a distant figure, not a god whose presence required secret knowledge. He was visible every night. His journey traced above the desert and the river. His waxing and waning reminded Egyptians that all things passed in cycles: growth, fullness, disappearance, return. To watch the moon was to watch Khonsu travel. To count the months was to feel his hand ordering the world. To live by his rhythm was to live in balance with eternity. And yet, as important as this role was, it was not the only one. For the Egyptians also believed that the night was a place of danger. Demons wandered, spirits lurked, sickness struck unseen. And it was Khonsu, the moon traveller, who could protect them. In the stories that followed, he was not only the keeper of time, but the healer, the god who could banish spirits, who could cure illness, who could bring safety to those who walked in the dark. A role made famous in a tale carved forever in stone. The story of the Bentresh Stela. Chapter 3. Khonsu the Healer. We've seen Khonsu as the child of Amun and Mut, the traveller across the night sky, the reckoner of time. But for the Egyptians, he was more than a measure of months. He was a healer, a god whose very light was thought to drive away sickness, to banish evil spirits, to restore life where it was fading. In hymns and inscriptions, Khonsu is given titles that reveal this power. Khonsu who gives life, Khonsu the defender, Khonsu the great god who drives away evil spirits. These were not just flattering words. They were descriptions of what people believed he truly did. To understand this role, we need to look at how the Egyptians understood illness itself. They did not separate the body from the spirit the way we often do today. Sickness could come from natural causes: bad water, spoiled food, heat, but many times it was explained as the work of malevolent forces. A fever might be described as a demon seizing the body. A sudden pain could be the touch of an evil spirit. Night terrors, insomnia, madness, all were thought to be signs of dark beings pressing against the soul. And so healing was never only a matter of herbs or surgery. Though the Egyptians had skilled physicians, it was also spiritual. The protection of gods was essential, and few were called upon more often than Khonsu. In homes along the Nile, families whispered prayers to him when children were sick. Mothers called on his name to guard babies from the dangers of the night. Travelers invoked him to keep fever and exhaustion away on long journeys. His presence, the cool light of the moon, was thought to scatter harmful spirits like shadows fleeing at dawn. Amulets of Khonsu were carried, carved in stone or faience. On some, he appears as a youth with the sidelock of childhood, a reminder of his role in protecting children. On others, the lunar disk crowns his head, marking his power over the night. These amulets were not ornaments, they were shields. In temples, priests called upon him in rituals of healing. Incantations would name Khonsu directly.
asking him to expel the demon that caused the sickness. The afflicted person might be placed in front of his statue, the god's presence filling the chamber, incense curling upward, chants echoing through the halls. Some of these rituals survive in fragments on papyri. One text calls on Khonsu to come swiftly, drive out the one who attacks. Let the breath return. Let the body be whole. Simple words, but heavy with faith.
And it wasn't only humans who needed him. Khonsu was invoked for animals too. Cattle, donkeys, even dogs. For Egyptians, every life was under the eyes of the gods, and Khonsu's healing light fell on all living things. The Egyptians also linked Khonsu with fertility and birth. His cycle, the waxing and waning moon, mirrored the cycles of the womb, the hidden rhythms of creation. Prayers to him asked for conception, for safe delivery, for healthy children. In this, he was both healer and giver of life. There was also a protective side to this healing wrong. Khonsu was believed to bind and restrain spirits that brought illness. In one inscription, he is called Khonsu the Mighty, who binds the evil one in chains. This was not only about comfort, it was about victory, the god overpowering what humans could not see. Imagine living in ancient Thebes. The nights are long, the desert winds restless. You fear the sickness that seems to strike without warning, the nightmares that cling to your children, the sudden chills that no fire can drive away. And then, overhead, the moon appears. Khonsu is traveling. His light spills across the city, over the roofs of mud brick houses, over the temple courts. And you whisper his name, trusting that the traveler will keep your household safe. This was Khonsu's healing, not only in one famous story, but in the quiet faith of thousands of families who looked to him for protection. For them, he was not distant. He was the god they saw every night, the one who walked visibly through the sky. And yet, there was one story that sealed this image forever. A tale carved into stone, telling of a princess far from Egypt, a desperate plea, and a god who traveled beyond his homeland to heal. It is called the Bentresh Stela, and it is there we will turn next. Chapter 4. The Bentresh Stela. Among all the stories told of Khonsu, one shines the brightest. It is not a tale whispered in fragments, nor a myth passed loosely by word of mouth. It is carved into stone. The Bentresh Stela, discovered in Thebes and now preserved in the Louvre Museum. The inscription dates to the reign of Pharaoh Ramses II, the great king who ruled for more than 60 years, and it tells of a foreign princess, a daughter of a distant ruler, who fell gravely ill. Her father, desperate, sent word to Egypt. He asked Ramses to send help. Not soldiers, not physicians, but the power of the gods. The young woman's sickness was not seen as ordinary. It was believed to be the work of a spirit. The demon, that had seized her body. Ramses turned to Khonsu. Not Ra, the blazing sun. Not Isis, famed for her magic, but Khonsu, the moon traveller, the healer whose light drove away unseen forces. Priests at Karnak prepared the god's statue. First, they purified it with water from the Nile. They dressed it in fresh linen, embroidered with gold thread. They placed offerings before it: bread, wine, flowers, incense. And when the rituals were complete, they lifted the statue onto a sacred bark, a boat made for carrying the image of a god. To the Egyptians, this was no ordinary statue. It was not simply stone or metal. It was a vessel filled with the presence of Khonsu himself. When the bark moved, the god moved. When the statue traveled, the god traveled. And so, Khonsu left Thebes. He crossed deserts, passed through foreign lands, carried with honor and reverence. Everywhere the procession went, people bowed their heads, for they believed the moon god was truly among them. When the bark reached the princess's city, it was placed in a chamber near her bed. Priests performed the rites. They burned incense until the room filled with smoke. They recited prayers calling Khonsu to act. And then the spirit was confronted. The Stela tells us that Khonsu banished the demon. The sickness lifted. The young woman rose from her bed. She was restored to health, her body freed from the grip of the unseen. Her father was overwhelmed with gratitude. He showered Khonsu's statue with gifts, vessels of gold and silver, fine linen, precious stones. He begged the god to remain in his land, but the priests refused. Khonsu belonged to Thebes. His home was Karnak, beside Amun and Mut, his divine parents. And so the bark was prepared once more, offerings placed aboard, and Khonsu was carried back to Egypt. Imagine that return procession. The desert wind carrying the smell of incense, the rhythmic beat of drums marking each step, the priests chanting, their voices rising in the night air, and above them, the moon itself, Khonsu's eternal form, traveling home across the heavens. For the Egyptians who carved the story into stone, this was not just a miracle. It was proof. Proof that Khonsu's power was real, that he could travel beyond Egypt's borders, that his healing reached far and wide, as far as the moonlight touched. The Bentresh Stela is one of the longest surviving narratives of Khonsu. It shows us how the Egyptians saw their gods, not as distant, but as present, active, and compassionate. It shows us how illness was battled not only with herbs and medicines, but with faith and divine presence. And it shows us something deeper about Khonsu himself. He was not only the moon in the sky, or the keeper of time. He was a god who listened, who responded, who came when called. Even now, standing before the stela in the Louvre, you can see the hieroglyphs carved into its surface. You can trace the story with your eyes, the same way priests and pilgrims once traced it with their voices. A princess saved, a spirit banished, a god returned home in triumph. And from that story, Khonsu's reputation as healer spread farther still. Across Egypt, his name was spoken in prayers of protection, whispered at night to keep children safe, carved on amulets to guard against sickness. And in the great temple at Karnak, the memory of the journey was kept alive. A god who travelled, who healed, who returned. Chapter 5. Khonsu among the gods. Up to now, we've seen Khonsu as a healer, as a reckoner of time, as the gentle traveller across the sky. But in the great weave of Egyptian myth, no god stood alone. Each was part of a larger story, a family of deities, a hierarchy of powers, a balance of light and shadow. To understand Khonsu more deeply, we have to place him among the other gods, among his parents, Amun and Mut, among companions like Thoth, Ra and Horus, and even among those who feared him. In Thebes, Khonsu completed the Theban Triad. Amun was the hidden one, the great creator whose name meant the concealed. Mut was the mother, a goddess of queenship, often shown with the crown of vultures or with wings spread in protection. And Khonsu was their son, their living child, the youthful moon whose presence gave balance to the Triad. The political strength of Thebes was mirrored in this divine family. Pharaohs aligned themselves with Amun's supremacy, Mut's maternal protection, and Khonsu's power over time and healing. Together, the Triad embodied a complete world: father, mother, child, written in stone and celebrated in processions. But Khonsu was not only a child. He also belonged to a larger circle of gods whose powers overlapped and intertwined. One of the closest was Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom. Both Thoth and Khonsu were lunar gods, tied to the cycles of the moon. Thoth was the recorder of time, the scribe of the gods, the one who kept the order of the cosmos written in his scrolls. Khonsu, meanwhile, was the visible moon itself, the journeying light, the reckoner of months. It was as if Thoth was the pen and Khonsu was the clock. Sometimes the two were even merged in hymns, their powers blended, their names linked together. But more often, they were kept distinct. Two sides of lunar divinity, one intellectual, one embodied. Khonsu also stood beside Ra, the great sun god. If Ra travelled the heavens by day, Khonsu travelled them by night. Some inscriptions describe him as accompanying Ra in his solar bark, not as the leader, but as a companion, lending his light in the hours when darkness threatened. In this way, Khonsu was part of the eternal rhythm. Day and night, sun and moon, Ra and Khonsu. Together, they ensured that time flowed without end. He was also connected with Horus, the falcon-headed god of kingship. Khonsu too sometimes appeared in falcon form, crowned with the lunar disk. This imagery linked him to Horus, to the sky, and to the protection of the pharaoh himself. Yet Khonsu was not only gentle company. He also carried a darker, more dangerous side, one that made even other gods uneasy. In certain inscriptions, he is described as Khonsu the great god, who protects by striking, who devours the hearts of those who disobey him. Another text names him Khonsu, the slayer of gods. These words may sound strange to us, used to thinking of Khonsu as healer and protector. But for the Egyptians, divinity was never one-sided. A god who could heal was also a god who could punish. The same power that drove out demons could also turn against any being, human or divine, that threatened cosmic order. To call Khonsu the slayer of gods was not necessarily to say he went to war with his family. It was to acknowledge his overwhelming strength, his capacity to subdue even the mightiest if balance demanded it. He was both protector and destroyer. This duality made Khonsu all the more respected. He was a god of life, but also of fear. To love him was to trust in his healing light. To anger him was to risk being swallowed by that same light, consumed in its fire. Pharaohs recognized this. In their inscriptions, they sometimes called on Khonsu not only for healing and fertility, but for victory. On temple walls, Khonsu appears as a falcon-headed warrior, holding weapons, standing behind the king as divine support in battle. His moonlight, normally gentle, was imagined here as a blade cutting through the forces of chaos. This image brings us back to an essential truth of Egyptian religion. Every god carried contradictions. Ra was life-giving sun, yet also burning destruction. Osiris was lord of life after death, yet also ruler of the tomb. And Khonsu was both healer and devourer, protector and terror, moonlight and darkness. These contradictions were not flaws, they were balance. The Egyptians believed that creation endured only when opposites were held together. Order and chaos, life and death, kindness and fear. Khonsu embodied that balance as much as any god. And so, among the gods, Khonsu was respected, feared, and invoked in equal measure. He stood as child of Amun and Mut, companion of Ra, mirror of Thoth, echo of Horus, And yet, he was himself, the traveller, the healer, the devourer, the light of the moon. With this place in the divine order secured, Khonsu's name became one of the most powerful in all Thebes. His temple at Karnak was not a minor shrine, but a great complex of its own, visited, honoured, filled with offerings. For the people of Egypt, Khonsu was not just another god in the pantheon. He was one whose presence touched every night, every month, every healing prayer. And in that presence, he became not only the god of priests and pharaohs, but the god of travellers, the one whose name meant the traveller, whose journey across the night sky became a mirror for every human journey, across land and water. And so now we turn to that role, to Khonsu the guide, the protector of those who walked beneath his silver light. Khonsu the traveller. Chapter 6. Khonsu the traveller. The name Khonsu carries a meaning the Egyptians understood at once. The traveller, the passer-by, the one who crosses. They watched him cross the sky each night, a measured journey written in light. And from that simple, constant motion, a wider faith grew, that the God who travelled above also guarded every travel below, in a land shaped by a single river. Most journeys began with water. The Nile was Egypt's road, broad where the valley opened, narrow where cliffs pressed close, its banks dotted with fields, villages, and quays. By day, the sun baked the water into glitter, but by night, when heat fell away and breezes rose from the current, boats slipped loose from their moorings and moved by moonlight. To a boatman, Khonsu's path was not abstract. It was the glow that revealed a sandbank before the hull could find it. It was the soft outline of a reed bed, the glint of a crocodile's eye, the dark span of a bridge pier. Sailors would point to the waxing disk and speak the god's name. Not in ceremony, not always in hymns, simply with the familiarity of people who depended on what they could see. The Egyptians imagined the gods in boats for a reason. If Ra crossed the heavens in a solar bark, priests could also speak of Khonsu travelling in a lunar craft, not because a separate myth demanded it, but because river life made the metaphor natural. Processions within temple courts echoed this movement. Sacred statues were placed on barks, carried on shoulders, or floated along canals. The deity journeying among the people. When Khonsu's image left his shrine, it meant the traveller walked and sailed among them. Travel on land required different prayers. Egypt's deserts, east into the Wadi Hammamat, west toward hidden oases, north to the Sinai, south toward Nubia, could be cruel to the unprepared. Caravans moved at dawn and dusk, rested at wells and way stations, and counted the nights by the moon. A bright, high disk meant longer hours on the trail. A thin crescent meant camp was wiser. In such choices, Khonsu's phase became practical guidance, not only symbol. Ostraca and papyri preserve the ordinary concerns of movement. Lists of rations, tallies of donkeys, notes of who came and went through gatehouses. Behind those dry records was a living habit. Before a group set out, the leader might pour a libation, leave a handful of grain at a roadside shrine, or mutter a line asking the moon's traveller to keep watch. The official prayers were the priest's domain, but small invocations, quiet gestures, those belonged to everyone. In temple reliefs, Khonsu often appears with the side lock of youth and the lunar disk. Where he stands beside the king, he presents life and protection, signs the Egyptians read as real gifts, not metaphors. If the king marched north or sailed south on a royal inspection, artists carved Khonsu nearby, a visual promise that the journey lay within divine sight. Festivals also unfolded as journeys. Thebes kept great processions in which the gods left their inner sanctuaries and crossed from one temple to another. At night, torchlight and music joined the moon above. People lined the avenues of sphinxes not merely to watch, but to be watched in return. To stand within the path of a god who travelled. In such hours, Khonsu's title felt literal. The city itself became a map for the divine crossing. Its pylons and courts, stages for a god in motion. Not all travel was peaceful. Egypt sent expeditions to quarries and mines, to collect stone at Hammamet and turquoise in the Sinai. Scribes counted the men, captains accounted the tools, priests performed rites for safe return. In those contexts, the moon was more than a lamp. It marked the count of days since a party left, the omen of timing for a risky pass, the watch by which guards kept the perimeter through the cool hours of night. To say Khonsu protects travellers meant all of this together. Counting, guiding, guarding. Household religion reflected the same trust. Before a relative set out, a small amulet might be pressed into the palm. Faience blue, like water under moonlight, or stone, warmed by the hand. Mothers traced the sign of life in the air. Fathers told a child to look up and walk with the moon. Few of these scenes were written down, but they repeat across centuries in the objects left behind. Beads, pendants, simple dedications scratched onto potsherds, the names of gods invoked in brief lines for a safe return. Khonsu's name is among them. He also belonged to the time of journeys. Priests who observed the crescents didn't do so in isolation. The months they declared governed contracts, market days, and when barges met at certain quays. A caravan's departure might be marked by the first appearance of a new moon. A shipment due by the full meant a tight, shared clock everyone could see. When sources call Khonsu the reckoner of months, they're describing a god whose movement made human movements coordinate. The moon's phases carried meaning for the body as well. Texts and amulets link Khonsu to fertility and safe birth, not in abstract, but as an answer to fear. A woman travelling late in pregnancy, a family moving villages by boat, the midwife making a night call. All might glance upward and take courage from the light's return after darkness. In this way, the traveller's protection crossed from roads and rivers into the thresholds of homes. The Egyptians also told of demons of the night, forces blamed for sudden illness and dangerous dreams. Travellers were exposed. The liminal hours, the unfamiliar ground, the strangeness of sleeping under open sky. Ritual language calls Khonsu the one who drives away such beings, who binds the harmful and gives breath back to the afflicted. The famous healing we told in the last chapter, the Stela of Bentresh, is the grand example, but its logic is older and broader. The God who moves where people cannot see, who reaches where people cannot go, and who returns them safely. In Thebes, the temple of Khonsu preserved this travelling identity in stone. Gates and courts were aligned to receive processions. Side chapels held secondary shrines that could be visited, while the main sanctuary stayed closed. At times, Khonsu's image left his enclosure to visit other temples within the Karnak precinct, or to join city-wide rites. Those motions, recorded in reliefs and festival lists, let ordinary people stand along the route and meet the god halfway. The traveller crossed the sky. The city crossed itself to greet him. Night after night, these meanings accumulated. A clerk writing accounts by lamplight noted the date. Under the eye of the moon. A fisherman pulled his nets because the water shone enough to see their line. A caravan master lifted a water skin to the sky and judged the night's distance by the moon's height. None of this required doctrine. It required only the habit of living with Khonsu's steady crossing. When Greek and Roman visitors later walked among Egypt's temples, they brought their own names: Selene, Artemis, lunar, and compared them to what they saw. They understood the link between travel and the moon, between timekeeping and the night sky, because those practices were familiar across the Mediterranean. But in Thebes, Khonsu's identity remained Egyptian, a child of Amun and Mut, a healer, a guardian, a god whose journey gave meaning to every other journey. Think of the simplest image. A bark gliding over black water, a thin wake folding back on itself under the oars. On the deck, a small shrine houses a statue crowned with the lunar disk and crescent. On the banks, people pause in their work and turn their heads. No proclamation is needed. The movement is the message. The god travels. He is present. And when the god is present, a journey changes. A family steps aboard with less fear. A caravan decides the pass can be taken by dawn. A patrol on the desert road keeps its watch until the disk sets, then hands the night to the first pale line of day. In the quiet math of such choices, Khonsu's protection becomes visible. Not as a miracle shouted across stone, but as a pattern of safe arrivals, written in the lives of many. The Egyptians did not require new stories to renew their trust. They had the cycle itself. Disappearance, return. Disappearance, return. Each time the moon thinned to nothing and came back, Khonsu proved the world's order again. The traveller kept travelling. Therefore so could they. And so, chapter by chapter of the night, the moon crossed the sky above Thebes, Memphis, Elephantine, and the long fields between. Boats moved, caravans advanced, families slept, priests counted days. Khonsu's journey held them together, the common clock, the common light, the common guard against what moved unseen. From here, there remains one part of his story to set in place, the memory of where this trust was anchored. What stones and carvings carry his name, and how later ages understood the traveller whose light still touches ruins at dusk. We'll finish with that, with Khonsu remembered in temples, in inscriptions, and in the echoes left for us to read. Chapter 7. Khonsu Remembered. We have followed Khonsu through many paths, as child of Amun and Mut, as reckoner of time, as healer, as traveller. But gods are not only remembered in stories, they are remembered in stone, in inscriptions, in the silence of ruins that still rise under the same moonlight he was said to embody. Nowhere is this clearer than at Karnak, in Thebes. Among the great pylons and courts, beyond the towering hypostyle hall, stands a temple built for Khonsu himself. It was begun in the reign of Ramses III, around the 12th century BCE, and finished by his successors, each pharaoh adding their mark, carving their names alongside Khonsu's. The temple is smaller than the grand house of Amun, but no less precise. Its walls show processions of gods, offerings carried by kings, hymns chiseled in hieroglyphs. In one relief, Khonsu sits crowned with the crescent and disc, extending the sign of life to the pharaoh. In another, he stands with a falcon's head, his youthful side lock curling by his ear. Walk through it today, and the stone still holds the coolness of shadow, even under the burning sun. Columns rise in measured rhythm, their capitals carved with lotus and papyrus, the plants of the Nile Valley. Chambers lead inward, darker and quieter, until one reaches the sanctuary where his statue once stood. There, the traveller rested, until called out for processions, until carried into the moonlight once more. Archaeologists tell us the temple was not only a shrine, but an observatory of sorts. Ceilings were painted with stars, constellations mapped in coloured plaster. For priests, the temple was a calendar in stone, its alignments matching the heavens, its rituals timed to the cycles Khonsu governed. Yet Khonsu was not confined to Thebes. Inscriptions in other cities call on him. Memphis in the north, Edfu in the south, even as far as Nubia beyond the first cataract. His reputation as a healer spread, echoing the tale of Bentresh, invoked by families and travellers far from the temple courts. In some hymns, Khonsu is praised side by side with Osiris, Lord of the Dead, for bringing renewal. In others with Horus, for protecting kingship. The flexibility of his image, youth, falcon, healer, warrior, allowed him to stand beside many gods without losing his own identity. Through the late period and into the time of the Ptolemies, when Greek rulers sat on Egypt's throne, Khonsu's cult remained alive. The Greeks compared him with Selene, goddess of the moon, and with Artemis, the huntress of the night. The Romans, too, saw in him an echo of Lunar, their moon deity. Yet in Egypt, his name never lost its own shape. Even when foreign scribes wrote of him, they preserved the sense of the traveller, the healer, the god of silver light. His temple at Karnak endured into late antiquity. Pilgrims left offerings, scratched graffiti into its walls, whispered prayers in its courts. Some of those faint marks are still visible, human hands reaching across centuries, leaving proof that they once stood there, invoking Khonsu under the glow of the moon. Today, the temple remains one of the best preserved parts of the Karnak complex. Tourists walk its courts, scholars study its inscriptions, guides point to the reliefs of Khonsu with the side lock of youth. And at night, when the floodlights are dimmed, the actual moon rises above the pylons, the same moon that Egyptians saw 3,000 years ago, the same moon they called Khonsu. In this way, he's not only remembered in texts or museums, he is remembered in the simple act of looking up. Every crescent that appears in the sky repeats his name. Every cycle of waxing and waning repeats his story. The traveller has not vanished. He still crosses the night, as he did for the kings of Thebes, as he did for the boatmen of the Nile, as he did for the father of the princess, carved on the Bentresh Stela. His temple may be quiet, his offerings long faded, but his journey continues, visible to anyone who lifts their eyes to the heavens. And so, Khonsu endures, not in battles, not in loud myths, but in the rhythm of night itself, in time, in healing, in the steady glow that gives courage to travellers and peace to sleepers. He remains, even now, the traveller, the healer, the moon. You've been listening to the Lady Mythos, where forgotten stories breathe again. Tonight, we walked beneath the moon with Khonsu, the child of Amun and Mut, the keeper of months, the healer who banished spirits, the traveller who watched over every journey. If your eyes are still open, let them close now. Let the silver light of the traveller fade into your dreams. And if you are already drifting, perhaps Khonsu will walk with you there, a guardian not of sunlit hours, but of night, steady, quiet, eternal. Sweet dreams. Sleep well. And thank you for listening.